Hi chess fans, we're looking at the game between Micky Adams with white and McDonald's with black. McDonald is a player that is rated 2400. Micky Adams played e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, and c3 is the delayed Alapin. And after d5, the other principal plan is knight f6. White takes, queen takes, and white plays d4. White is controlling the d4 square, and as we will see in the game, the idea is that if black exchanges here, white exchanges back, and white ends up with an isolated pawn. So black played bishop g4, and after bishop e2, black takes, and after c takes, we have a positional feature in this position, which is an isolated pawn. It's a resource that can be good for black. If black exchanges all the pieces, this pawn can typically be attacked in the rook ending, but in the meantime, white has active piece play and can potentially push the pawn, gaining some advantage in some positions. And the active piece play is particularly interesting because the black king is still in the center of the board. If the black king castles long, it's very open, and to castle short, black still has to move a lot of pieces. So black plays e6 to develop those pieces, and after knight c3, it becomes clear that the queen in the center of the board is the tactical liability of black that allows white to develop his pieces with tempo. After queen d6, white played d5. So one feature of the isolated pawn is that you can push it if it is advantageous. It's always a candidate move that you want to look at. And in this particular position, white is protecting the d5 square. And if black exchanges here, which he has to because also the knight is exchanged, white is able to open up the position, highlighting the positional liability of black's king in the center. So black takes, and in this position here, have a look at the candidate moves of white. What can white play here? Okay, black is a pawn up, so white could surely take back this pawn and has eliminated the positional feature of the isolated pawn in the position. And this is a position where black can castle long and consolidate. The queens are off the board, the knight is attacked, has to move back, and black gets some play with bishop b4. And for example, after h3, castle, the position is relatively equal. An alternative would be to take with the knight, but here black also gets some play after a long castle, and the knight is attacked, but white can still play this with a counterattack on the bishop. But after bishop h5, knight c3, the position has also equalized. If anything, black is maybe a little bit better because white still hasn't castled. So in this position, Micky Adams played the very interesting move castle. So this creates a strong imbalance in the position. And let's look at the resources that Micky has created here. The black king is in the middle and open. That's a big tactical liability. And this is weighted against the resource that black has, which is black is a pawn up. And this is the key feature now of this position. The game now is around those two motives. After knight f6, black develops. White highlights again the tactical motive of a badly positioned queen and plays very topical with active piece play. So the second resource that white has is active piece play. So after knight b5, the queen has to move away to d7. And again, bishop f4. White has this big resource of active piece play, and the weak c7 square is a positional weakness in black's camp, and white is now threatening a fork. And this is another tactical resource. As a result, black has to react to this threat and white is developing all his pieces a tempo. Okay, now very interesting move by Micky Adams. Maybe some players would now have played rook e1, looking to attack the king, but it turns out that knight to e5 is even sharper. So in this position, black still has the slightly has a tactical white has a tactical resource that this queen can be attacked by the knight. Also, the king in the middle is a tactical liability. And the other feature in this position is that white has, maybe in some lines, if you calculate a few moves, a few candid moves, in some lines, white might be able to exchange this knight and create, after black takes, create a pawn weakness here. And knight e5 basically brings together all of these motives. The queen is attacked, and if in this position the knight would take, the bishop can take and is now threatening taking this knight and creating this pawn weakness, and at the same time also attacking this bishop. So the bishop has to take, and after queen takes, the black's king in the center this tactical liability is highlighted. So black has to play bishop e7, and then white has the idea of exchanging the knight. The bishop cannot take, so after pawn takes, white still has a lot of the resources, such as the black king in the middle, but also now all these pawn weaknesses here, which basically mean that all the rook endings, even though white is now a pawn down, basically all the rook endings are very favorable for white. And white can immediately continue pressuring the king like this. So that's why McDonald chose in this position. And again, the queen is attacked, and if the queen moves away, let's say the queen moves here, the bishop is attacked as well. So the only other move really is to play what happened in the game. Bishop takes e2, and there's a forced sequence here. Knight takes the queen, so black has to take the queen as well. And knight takes with check, and essentially it's a forced sequence. In both of the variations, black ends up with the bad pawn structure. After g takes, rook takes, we have reached a position without the queens, but essentially white now has the positional resources of the king in the middle and the active rooks and the pawn weaknesses. So in this position, you can already see at the engine, white is much better thanks to these resources, even though black is a pawn up. And after rook d8, because this pawn was attacked, rook f1, knight e5, white is already winning back the pawn. So if in this position bishop to e7, this is a very passive position, and you can already see that white easily wins here. Okay, so after knight e5, the material is now equal, and white continues to have the positional resources of active rooks and the weaknesses in black's pawn structure. So black plays bishop e7 and rook d1. All of this is exploiting the king in the middle. Rook d7, all forced. And now the interesting move, knight c3, exploiting the tactical liability that this rook is bound to the defense of the bishop on e7, but it is at the same time protecting this pawn, and by attacking this pawn we are overloading the rook. And if the pawn was to move to the front, it would get even weaker. Okay, so in this position McDonald played king f8, trying to move the king out of the pin, but now white wins this pawn. And the material count is now that white is now a pawn up. After rook takes, knight takes, bishop d8, we have reached an ending. Rook plus bishop with this rook and a knight, with a pawn up. So now for the rest of the video we will look at how you can win an ending like this. Not only is white a pawn up, the rook is also still passive on the square. Black has these weaknesses. And a little bit more subtle, but maybe the most important motive, this knight is dominating this bishop. So the knight is taking away all of these squares for the bishop. And the remaining squares that the bishop still has can easily be taken away by pawns. So if you see this motive, Micky Adams' next move becomes very clear because he plays rook c1 with the idea of simply attacking this bishop, and black has to defend this bishop with king e8. Okay, in this position, white tries to further highlight this positional disadvantage of the knight dominating the bishop and plays f4, taking away activity of the bishop. And after h5, the motive here is to activate the rook. White activates the king, another motive in this ending. Black uses time to activate his rook, and white continues to activate the king. Rook d6, attacking the knight, rook d1, simply protecting this knight. An interesting motive here, the rook could be pinned at some point, but the knight is on a light square, which means it cannot be attacked by the bishop. And there's also no pawns here that can attack the knight. And in addition to this, if the king, for example, approaches, the knight can always move back and protect the rook here. Okay, after rook c6, because black is realizing he's not going anywhere with attacking this knight, white plays rook to d2, essentially protecting all the pawns and denying the rook the entry square on c2. Another motive in an ending like this. Rook c1, black tries to do something, and very interesting, knight e3. So you might think, okay, the knight is protecting this square, denying the rook this square, but basically in this position here, knight e3 is a very strategic move. And the idea is that white is thinking, okay, what is my best setup in this ending? And then the strategy means, okay, once I have this best setup, I'm going to see that I move my pieces one by one to reach that setup. And the setup that white has in mind is to play pawn to b3, pawn to g3. The rook then protects those two pawns. And the knight has two good squares that are protected by pawns either here or here. And the next move all follow this strategy. So knight e3, preparing to move the knight to the good square here on c4 and still not revealing the setup, so it's also a flexible move. Rook a1, black tries to get some play, but this is only helping white with his ideal setup, b3. Bishop b6, trying to get some activity for the bishop. Knight f5, white doesn't want to exchange. And this is an interesting move as well. The white wants to go here. But in this position, white chooses to move the knight to f5, and then with a check move over here. And maybe this knight is even a little bit more active here. King f8, g3, rook c1, knight d6, rook c7, knight c4. White has completed his strategic goal and has now reached a position where he has reached the ideal setup that he wanted to have. Okay, after bishop c5, white is now moving to the next phase, attacking weaknesses. So this move attacks the pawn on h5 very concretely, and also limiting the activity of this rook, which is now bound to defend this bishop. Black plays b5, looking for some counterplay, attacking the knight, but the knight has another good square here on e5. And after bishop g1, attacking a pawn, white simply plays rook d2. Rook d2 is an interesting motive because in this position here, white knows I'm a pawn up, I'm having the good pawn structure, I'm having the more active king and the active knight. I'm going to play rook d2 to deny any counterplay to black. There's nothing that black can do in this position, and I can just slowly continue to centralize my king, attack the weaknesses, and then win. So the alternative would have been to say, okay, you can take this pawn, I'm just going to take this one, and in this variation, black doesn't want to take you necessarily, because then knight c4 is denying the rook the entry, so maybe it's a little bit better to play rook c3. But even here, the king simply moves to g2, attacking the bishop, and the bishop moves back, and now black has simply lost a pawn. The king is super safe on h3. So maybe bishop b5, maybe rook takes b5 would have been the stronger move, but white can simply enjoy the better structure and deny any counterplay. After king g7, black also tries to centralize the king. King e4, white continues to centralize the king. a6, knight f3 attacking the bishop. Bishop moves back, knight to h4. So in this position, it becomes already a little bit clear what white is trying to do here. After rook e7, king f3, white's plan is simply to move the king all the way here and attack this pawn. And white is arguing that black has nothing that he can do against it. And that's a very interesting motive. All the pieces coordinate. There are no weaknesses in white's camp, and black has weaknesses. So white simply very slowly moves his pieces into position to attack those weaknesses. After rook e6, king g2, bishop e6, it becomes clear that black doesn't have any plan. Black doesn't have anything that he can attack. The king cannot really move forward so well, so white simply continues with his plan. The knight moves away to make room for the king, and now black tries to bail out by exchanging rooks, and probably the rook ending after this exchange would be won for white as well. But white simply denies this exchange and tries to keep the pieces on the board. Rook to d3 is not really penetrating the position so much. Knight g5, keeping the square open for the king to attack the pawn. King g6, protecting the pawn. And now in this position here, a very interesting strategy, and this is the last strategic operation that will allow white to win the game. This is the reason why the king cannot come up. A very interesting motive. So white simply moves up and grabs this pawn, and black has to move the king up to protect the pawn, because now the knight is also denying the rook the protection of this pawn. So once the king comes up, white has the operation to attack this bishop a tempo and then move the rook to c6. And why is this such a good square? Well, because the bishop moved here, it's of course pinning the bishop against the king, but it is also attacking this weakness here on a6, and the rook is just super active here. And as often in rook endings, you want to move your rook to attack some weaknesses when it has become clear that black cannot attack your weaknesses, or maybe black can win one pawn while you can win 2 pawns. And in this position here, the rook is on an ideal square. It's also a light square, so it cannot be attacked by the bishop. It's a perfect square for the rook. So in this position here, after the king moves up, very, very interesting motive to transition the rook here a tempo even. Okay, so the king moves back, realizing how bad an idea it was to come up, but now the rook is already in an active square. White continues the plan to grab the pawn. Black now finally tries to attack a pawn as well. But now white simply wins a pawn because the king takes here. And after check, the bishop is attacked because the rook was also still bound to protecting this bishop. White takes this pawn here. Black could also immediately take the pawn, but plays b4 first. And here we have the tactical motive of this pin, and this pawn is attacked by the rook and the knight. So after rook takes, white is now 2 pawns up. So white has transformed the positional advantage of the king, and the strategic ploy of moving the king over to win this pawn, has transformed this into now an ending where he is 2 pawns up. And after king g8, rook d7, bishop c1, rook to d4, excuse me,